Look at her, everyone, my son said, staring dead into my eyes in the most expensive restaurant I had ever stepped foot in. This is what poverty looks like. You are too poor to be sitting here. Please, Michael. You don't belong here. The entire table fell completely silent. I stood there, clutching my worn leather handbag, wearing the only dress I could afford to patch rather than replace. His wife awkwardly turned her head away. One of his potential investors even let out a mocking smirk. Then Michael called over a server and had me moved to a tiny table tucked away near the kitchen doors. It was in that exact moment that something deep inside me shattered completely. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out my phone and made a single call. Harold, I said quietly, it's time. Before we go on, if this story touches your heart in any way, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how easily people forget the hands that raised them. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been judged because of your clothes, your money, or where you come from. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always love reading your messages. I live in a small, single-story house on the west side of San Antonio, Texas. The paint on the porch railing is peeling again, and every summer I tell myself I'm going to repaint it before the heat becomes too brutal. But somehow I never get around to it. Maybe because after a while, some things just don't matter as much anymore. Or maybe because when you get older, you learn to live with things left unfinished. Most mornings I wake up before the sun. I make my coffee in the same chipped ceramic mug my husband, Carlos, bought me 23 years ago at a roadside gift shop just outside El Paso. The handle is cracked now, but I still use it. I think that says a lot about me. Even when things start falling apart, I hold onto them tightly, especially people. After Carlos passed away, this house became painfully quiet. At first I kept the television on just to hear another human voice in the rooms, but eventually even that grew exhausting. So now I spend most of my time volunteering at the St. Matthew food pantry, tending to my small garden, and pretending I don't notice how rarely my phone rings. My son Michael used to call every Sunday, then it became once a month, and after that only on major holidays. Now sometimes a full 6 months will pass before I hear his voice. Yet every single time my screen lights up with his name, my heart still flutters the exact same way it did when he was 5 years old, running into my arms after preschool. For a mother, no matter how old her child gets, that feeling never truly changes. 3 weeks before that dinner, I was folding laundry when my phone rang. Michael, just seeing his name, brought a smile to my face. I answered on the second ring. Hi, sweetheart. There was a brief pause on the other end, not a warm pause but a distracted one. Hey, Mom. I could hear the rush of traffic and people talking in the background. He sounded busy, important, and very far away. Are you doing all right? I asked gently. Yeah, listen, I want to invite you to dinner next Friday. I nearly dropped the towel in my hands. It's at a restaurant in Dallas. It's a huge night for me. Investors, business partners, Vanessa will be there. His voice sounded rehearsed, almost rushed, but I barely registered it because it was the first time in years my son had invited me anywhere. Hope filled my chest. Oh, Michael, I would love to. Great, he replied quickly. Just look presentable, okay? I let out a soft laugh. I'll do my best. There was another silence, and then he added, This dinner is very important. The way he said it made me feel a bit uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. But I pushed the feeling aside. Lonely people are experts at ignoring warning signs. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of my bed for nearly 10 minutes, just staring at the wall with tears in my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of pure joy. I truly believed my son missed me. That night I opened the old cedar chest in my closet where I keep the precious things I can't bring myself to throw away. It was filled with memories of a completely different life. Carlos's leather wallet, the birthday cards Michael drew for me as a little boy, a miniature baseball glove from Little League. And at the very bottom, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was my navy blue dress. I hadn't worn it in nearly 4 years. Even when I bought it, it wasn't expensive. But on our 25th anniversary dinner, Carlos had told me I looked absolutely beautiful in it. That was enough reason for me to keep it forever. I held the dress against myself in front of the mirror, a bittersweet smile on my face. Well, I whispered to the memory of Carlos, our boy is finally inviting me somewhere. Over the next few days, I prepared for that dinner as if it were the most critical event of my life, because maybe it was. I took the dress to a local tailor down the street to fix a loose hem. I polished my old shoes at the kitchen table myself. One afternoon, I even skipped buying groceries just to save enough money to get my hair done at a salon near the church. The young stylist kept showing me trendy haircuts on her phone. I just smiled politely. At my age, I told her, simple is best. But the truth was, I wanted to look respectable for my son. I wanted him to feel proud walking next to me. Looking back now, the heartbreak of that realization hurts more than I can easily explain. A few days before I was supposed to leave for Dallas, my granddaughter Emma called me. Grandma, her sweet voice instantly brightened my day. "Oh, there's my favorite girl." She giggled. "Daddy said you're coming to Dallas." "Yes, I am." "I'm glad," she said, her voice dropping significantly. Something in her tone made me pause. "Sweetheart, why are you whispering?" "No reason, but children often know far more than adults give them credit for." "Are you okay?" I asked. There was another pause. Then in a tiny whisper she said, "Grandma, don't let them make you feel small." My smile faded. "What do you mean by that?" But before she could answer, I heard Vanessa's sharp voice in the background. "Emma, go finish your homework. Right now." A second later, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, unsettled. For the first time since Michael invited me, doubt started creeping into my mind. But I forced it away. Mothers survive on hope far longer than they do on logic. The morning of the dinner, I woke up before dawn. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, carefully curling my greying hair the way Carlos always liked it. Then I put on my navy blue dress and wore the small pearl earrings Carlos bought me the day Michael graduated from college. I remember how proud we were that day. Carlos cried harder than I did. "One day," he told me afterward, "our boy is going to do incredible things." He was right. Michael did achieve success. He became everything we dreamed for him, except for one thing: he forgot how to be kind. Before leaving the house, I took one last look around my small living room. The worn sofa, the faded curtains, the shelves lined with family photos, especially the one of Michael at 10 years old, missing his front teeth, smiling as he held my hand. Back then, he used to tell everyone I was his hero. I gently touched the frame. Then I grabbed my purse and left for Dallas. I still fully believed that underneath the expensive suits and the perfect smiles, my little boy was waiting for me. I had no idea that by the end of the night, my heart would be completely shattered in front of a room full of strangers. To someone like me, Dallas always felt a bit too bright, too polished, too expensive, and far too fast. When my long-distance bus pulled into the downtown station that evening, I nervously pressed my fingers against my bag, looking out at the skyscrapers reflecting the setting sun. Men in tailored suits hurried down the sidewalks, and luxury cars glided silently through traffic like scenes from a movie I could never afford to watch. I suddenly felt incredibly self-conscious of my shoes, the wrinkled skin on my hands, and my coat, which was nearly a decade old. Still, I kept reminding myself why I was here. Michael had invited me. That thought alone was enough to carry me through the wave of anxiety building in my stomach. I took a cab to the restaurant. Even saying the name made me nervous. I practiced pronouncing it 3 times before getting out. The entrance looked more like a luxury hotel than a place to eat. High glass doors, marble floors, and a water wall that shimmered under soft amber lights. When I walked inside, the hostess smiled politely, though I noticed her eyes take a quick, brief sweep of my clothes before looking back at her computer. "Name for the reservation, please," she asked. "Michael Martinez." Her expression changed instantly. "Oh, of course." It caught me off guard. She immediately stood up straighter and flashed a much wider smile. "They are in the private dining room area." As she led me through the restaurant, I could feel eyes turning toward me from elegant tables where wealthy couples sat drinking wine. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and soft piano music drifted through the room. I felt completely out of place. The hostess stopped in front of a large private room, separated by glass walls. There he was, my son. Michael stood in the center of the room, laughing confidently next to a group of wealthy men in dark suits. His expensive watch caught the light as he shook hands with a man I recognized from business interviews on television. For a brief moment, pride filled my chest so suddenly it almost ached. That was my boy, my little boy. Then Michael saw me, the look on his face shifted. The smile vanished instantly, not because he was excited but because he was uncomfortable. I saw it immediately. His eyes flicked to my coat, my old bag, my shoes. Then he forced a tight, rigid smile and walked toward me. "Mom," he said under his breath. I leaned in to hug him, but he only gave me a quick sideways embrace. "You made it." "Of course I did," I said warmly. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." His attention flickered nervously over my shoulder toward the table. "Right." I tried to ignore the strange tension in his voice. Just then, a woman holding a crystal glass walked over to us. Vanessa. She looked beautiful in a silver designer dress. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, and diamonds caught the light at her throat. But somehow she still carried an air of impatience. "Evelyn," she said with a thin smile. "It's so good to see you," I replied sincerely. She kissed the air next to my cheek, barely touching me. "We weren't sure if you'd actually make the trip all the way from San Antonio." Michael let out an awkward laugh. "My mom is stubborn." I smiled gently. "That is true." But neither of them laughed with me. Before I could say anything else, a tall man with silver hair approached us. "Michael," he said confidently, "is this your mother?" Michael hesitated. It only lasted for a fraction of a second, but a mother notices those things every single time. "Yes," he finally answered. "This is my mom, Evelyn." The man extended his hand warmly. "Richard Coleman, I've heard a lot about you." Something about the way he said it made me feel slightly uneasy. I shook his hand politely. "I hope it was all good things." Richard chuckled. "Well, Michael has mentioned he comes from very humble beginnings." Vanessa quickly cut in. "Look how far he's come since then," she added proudly. I noticed the emphasis immediately. Not we, not the family, just him. Michael guided me toward the table. "This dinner is important," he whispered in a low voice. "Just relax, okay?" The comment confused me. I am relaxed. Good. The dining table was incredibly large, decorated with candles and white roses. Everyone sitting there looked wealthy, polished, and secure. Women wearing diamond bracelets, men discussing investments and resorts. These people spent more on a single dinner than I spent on expenses in 3 months. As I carefully took my seat, the conversation slowed down almost imperceptibly. I could feel them observing me, trying to understand how I fit into the perfect image Michael had built. A woman smiled politely. "So Evelyn, what do you do?" I opened my mouth, but Vanessa answered before I could. "She mostly stays busy with church activities and community volunteering. Mostly." The word strung far more than it should have. It was as if my entire life could be reduced to a footnote. "I like to help people," I said softly. "That's lovely," another woman replied with the kind of smile people use when speaking to a child. Michael immediately steered the conversation back to business projections and expansion plans. I sat quietly and listened as expensive red wine was poured all around me. No one offered me any. Not at first, and somehow that felt a bit more pointed than I expected. A server finally approached. "Would you care for some wine, ma'am?" Before I could answer, Michael spoke up. "She'll just have water." I looked at him surprised. "Actually, I wouldn't mind a glass of." "Water is fine, Mom." He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. The server nodded awkwardly and walked away. A flush of heat crept up my neck. I suddenly felt very small. As dinner progressed, I watched Michael speak with a confidence I barely recognized anymore. He talked about luxury developments, high-end partnerships, and future acquisitions. Everything sounded expensive. Everything sounded impressive. Yet every few minutes, I would catch him glancing at me nervously, as if he were terrified I was going to embarrass him. At one point, Richard leaned back and smiled. "You know, Michael, I respect a man who values family. A lot of successful men don't keep close ties with their parents." Michael chuckled softly. "Yeah, family is everything to me." The lie felt like a heavy stone dropping into my stomach, because deep down I realized something terrible. I wasn't here because Michael missed me. I was here because I made him look good. A prop, a performance, a piece of evidence to prove he hadn't forgotten where he came from. Suddenly Emma appeared by my chair. "Grandma." The moment she saw me, her face lit up completely. Unlike everyone else in the room, her hug felt real. I held her tight. "You look beautiful tonight," she whispered. "So do you, sweetheart." Then she added softly in my ear, "I'm really glad you're here." I pulled back slightly. There was a sadness in her eyes, almost a fear. Before I could ask why, Vanessa called out sharply from across the table, "Emma, go sit back down properly." Emma obeyed instantly. The warmth left the room once again. When the main course arrived, I accidentally overheard two investors sitting at the end of the table whispering to each other. I thought his mother lived in assisted housing or something. Yeah, that's what I heard too. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly to look at Michael. He avoided my eyes completely. In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being ignored. My son was ashamed of me, not because I had failed him, but because I reminded him of where he started. The moment I realized Michael was ashamed of me, a dull ache started deep in my chest that I can't quite describe. It wasn't sharp or sudden, just heavy, like a sadness that had been sleeping beneath the surface for years was slowly waking up. I looked down at the white tablecloth in front of me, trying to pretend I hadn't heard the investors whispering. Around me, silver utensils clinked against expensive plates, and the talk about money and luxury resorts continued as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything changed, because once a mother sees embarrassment in her child's eyes, she can never unsee it. The server placed a plate in front of me, arranged so beautifully it barely looked like food. Thin slices of steak sat under delicate herbs and colourful sauces painted across the porcelain. I smiled politely, "Thank you." As I reached for my fork, Vanessa glanced at my hand, then at my handbag resting against the chair, and finally at Michael. It was a tiny exchange of looks between them that communicated far more than words ever could. Vanessa leaned in toward me, a smile on her face that looked sweet from a distance. "You know," she murmured softly, "this restaurant has a very strict dress code, but I suppose Michael made an exception tonight." The words felt like a slap. I forced a small smile. "I did the best I could." "Oh, of course," she replied quickly. "I didn't mean anything by it." But she did. People always mean something when they say things like that. Across the table, Richard Coleman continued talking about investment opportunities, while Michael nodded along with confidence. It felt so strange to watch my son laugh and charm everyone around him, because I remembered the boy who cried when he scraped his knee playing baseball, the boy who slept by the edge of my bed after Carlos died, because he was terrified I would be lonely. Where did that boy go? Emma reached out under the table and squeezed my hand gently. I squeezed back, grateful for the gesture. She was the only source of warmth left in the room. Then Richard looked back at me suddenly. "So Evelyn," he said amiably, "Michael tells us you made a lot of sacrifices for him growing up." I opened my mouth to answer, but Michael cut in almost instantly. "Things were tough back then for everyone," he said casually, "but I worked hard and built everything myself." Built everything myself. The phrase cut deeper than he could have ever realized, not because I wanted credit, but because I remembered every single sacrifice behind that success. The double shifts cleaning hotel rooms, the nights I skipped dinner entirely so he would have enough to eat before soccer practice, the years I wore the same worn-out shoes just so he could afford to be in a good school district. I remembered selling my wedding necklace after Carlos passed away just to help pay for his college housing deposit. And now, sitting under a crystal chandelier that cost more than my entire house, my son dismissed it all in a single sentence. I lowered my head before anyone could see the pain in my eyes. A few minutes later, a server holding a glass approached. As he carefully reached across the table, someone bumped his arm from behind. The glass tilted, and red wine spilled out, splashing directly onto the front of my navy blue dress. A collective gasp went up around the table. "Oh my goodness," the server stammered. "Ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry." "It's all right," I said quickly, trying to defuse the tension. "Accidents happen." I grabbed a napkin, attempting to gently blot the stain, but Vanessa let out an exaggerated sigh next to me. "Oh no," she muttered, "that's unfortunate." Michael's jaw clenched instantly, not out of concern for me but out of irritation. The server kept apologizing nervously while I tried to reassure him. "Please don't worry," I said kindly. "It's just a dress." Then Michael snapped. For God's sake. The entire table went completely silent. He stared directly at me, a frustrated anger burning in his expression. Can you not just be careful for one single evening? Shock rippled through my chest. I hadn't. This dinner is extremely important, Mom. His voice was cold now, sharp and restrained, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. Everyone around the table avoided eye contact. Vanessa looked embarrassed, not for me but for him, for the scene. I said I was sorry, I murmured under my breath. Michael rubbed his temple aggressively. You just don't understand how bad this looks. The silence in the room became unbearable. I could hear the piano music from the main dining room clearly through the glass walls. Emma stared at her father in disbelief. Dad. But Michael kept going. You show up in clothes that don't fit the venue and now you're spilling wine everywhere. She didn't spill it, Emma protested softly. Michael ignored her entirely. Then he looked straight at me and said the words that forever broke something between us. Mom, you are too poor to be sitting here. My breath caught, not physically but emotionally. The entire world around me seemed to freeze. Even the server looked horrified. Vanessa whispered sharply, Michael. But he was already too deep into his own resentment. You simply don't belong in settings like this, he continued in a low, harsh tone. These are important people. These are important people. The implication hung heavily in the air. What did that make me? A burden, an embarrassment, a mistake from a life of poverty he wanted to erase. I looked around the table. No one spoke up for me, not a single person. Richard Coleman looked deeply uncomfortable, but even he remained silent. The investors stared down at their plates. Vanessa looked away. Only Emma looked completely heartbroken. Then Michael turned to the server. Can you move her to another table? The server blinked confused. Sir, somewhere quieter. His expression hardened further. Somewhere in the back near the rear. As if I were an object that needed to be hidden from view. Humiliation burned against my skin, but strangely I still didn't cry. Not yet. The server looked at me apologetically. You don't have to move, ma'am. But I slowly stood up anyway. My legs felt weak beneath me. It's all right, I said softly. I picked up my handbag carefully. For a brief second, I caught sight of Emma silently crying into her plate. That broke my heart almost more than Michael's words, because children should never have to witness that kind of cruelty from their own parents. As I walked away from that private table, following the server, I immediately heard low whispers behind me. Wealthy people always whisper when they're uncomfortable. The tiny table near the kitchen sat right next to the swinging service doors, where staff hurried in and out with heavy trays. The smell of garlic and grease filled the crowded corner. It was loud, hot, and hidden. It was exactly the kind of place you put someone you don't want anyone to see. I sat down slowly. For a few seconds I just stared at my hands resting in my lap. The same hands that had held him when he had fevers, that had packed his school lunches, that had worked until the skin cracked from bleach and cleaning chemicals. And tonight, those same hands were shaking slightly from sheer humiliation. A single tear finally spilled over my cheek. I wiped it away immediately. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly 2 years. The phone rang only once before a calm, older voice answered. This is Harold Whitman. I closed my eyes for a brief second. When I spoke, my voice was far steadier than I felt inside. Harold, I said quietly, it's time. There was a silence, then his tone changed instantly. What happened? I looked across the restaurant, toward the private room where my son sat laughing with his investors, pretending I no longer existed, as if humiliating his mother was just another minor inconvenience to be cleared away before dessert. For the first time tonight, my heartbreak began to turn into something else, something colder and much harder. I'm ready now, I whispered. Harold didn't ask unnecessary questions. That was one of the reasons Carlos had trusted him so deeply for all those years. After my husband passed away, Harold Whitman became the only person in the world who knew every single secret Carlos left behind. He handled the legal documents, the investments, the contracts, and the promises I had spent decades protecting. Promises my own son knew absolutely nothing about. I pressed the phone tightly to my ear as the noise from the kitchen doors rattled around me. What occurred? Harold repeated, his voice dropping lower. I looked through the glass wall at the dining room. I swallowed down the bitterness in my throat. He finally showed me exactly who he has become, I said softly. Harold was silent for a moment, then he let out a soft sigh. I always feared this day would come. Another tear slipped down my face, but my voice remained steady. So did I. Are you certain? He asked cautiously. The question mattered because once some things are set in motion, it is very difficult to go back. I closed my eyes. Images flashed through my mind. Michael at 7 years old running into my arms after school, Michael crying at Carlos's funeral, Michael promising me he would always take care of his mom. And then tonight, Mom, you are too poor to be sitting here. The words cut like broken glass in my chest. Yes, I said quietly, I'm certain. Harold's tone shifted instantly back into professional calm. Very well, give me 20 minutes, and then he hung up. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the dark screen in my trembling hand. For the first time all evening, I noticed how exhausted I felt. Not physically, but emotionally. It felt as though I had spent years carrying the weight of a love for someone who no longer knew how to give it back to me. A young waitress walked up to my small table nervously. Ma'am, she said softly. I looked up. I am so incredibly sorry about what happened back there. Her kindness nearly brought me to tears again. It's not your fault, I said gently. She hesitated before putting down a fresh napkin. I just wanted to say, she lowered her voice, no one deserves to be treated that way. I gave her a weak smile. Thank you. Before she left, she glanced over at the private dining area, a slight frown on her face. I think your granddaughter is trying to come over here. I turned my head just in time to see Emma attempting to slip away from the table, but Vanessa caught her by the wrist before she could leave. Emma looked at me helpless. Vanessa whispered something harsh in her ear, then flashed a smile at the investors. Emma sat back down slowly, though her eyes stayed fixed on me the entire time. That hurt more than anything, because children remember moments like that forever. I turned my face away before the tears could start again. A few minutes later, Michael finally walked over to my table. His expression was tense and annoyed. No guilt, no shame, just irritation. Mom, he said in a low, tight voice, what are you doing? I blinked, confused. I am sitting exactly where you had them put me. He looked around nervously. Can you just not make a scene? A bitter ache spread through my chest. Make a scene? I looked down at the red wine stain spreading across my dress, then back up at my son. I had never realized before that humiliation could have levels. His jaw tightened. You know what I mean. No, I replied softly, I don't think I do. Michael let out a harsh breath, lowering his voice even further. These people are considering a major partnership with me. Tonight is important and I am not. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something crossed his face. Guilt, but it vanished almost instantly. Mom, please don't do this right now. Do this as if pain were an inconvenience, as if heartbreak were a matter of bad timing. I looked at my son in the dim light of the restaurant, suddenly realizing something terrible. He genuinely believed he was the victim tonight. Not me, but him, because narcissism always has a strange way of rewriting reality. You're embarrassing me, he whispered sharply. I stared at him in disbelief. Then, before I could even formulate a response, a commotion near the front entrance caught everyone's attention. A tall woman dressed in a sharp, black-tailored suit walked into the restaurant with a commanding stride. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, and every staff member she passed immediately straightened up. Sophia Reed. Even from a distance I recognized her instantly. She was the regional director of operations for the hospitality group. Michael noticed her too. His expression brightened immediately. Great, he muttered, maybe she can sort this out. Sort this out, as if it were a public relations issue rather than an act of cruelty. Sophia spoke briefly with the hostess at the front. Then a manager hurried over to her, his face pale and anxious. After a moment the manager pointed directly toward me. Sophia's gaze followed his hand. The exact second she recognized my face, her expression shifted completely. Shock followed by absolute panic. She immediately turned and marched straight toward my tiny table. Michael frowned beside me. You know her. Before I could answer, Sophia arrived. To Michael's obvious confusion, she looked straight at me, completely ignoring him. Mrs. Martinez, she said, her voice careful, I am so incredibly sorry. Michael blinked. What's going on? Sophia ignored him entirely for several seconds. That alone left him stunned. I had no idea you were here tonight, she continued apologetically. If I had known. It's all right, I said softly, cutting her off. But Sophia looked terrified. No, ma'am, it is absolutely not all right. The surrounding staff froze. Even the servers suddenly looked incredibly nervous. Michael straightened his posture awkwardly. Sophia, this is my mother. I am very well aware of who she is, Sophia snapped back instantly. Something in her tone caused Michael's confidence to falter. Richard Coleman and several of the investors were now openly watching from the private room. Vanessa looked confused. Emma looked hopeful. Michael forced a laugh. Well, obviously, he gestured toward me impatiently. There was just a misunderstanding tonight. Sophia's expression darkened slightly. A misunderstanding, no one spoke. The air around us suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Then Sophia looked at the wine stain on my dress. She looked at the isolated little table near the kitchen, my untouched plate of food, and finally she saw the tears I hadn't quite managed to hide. When she looked back at Michael, her face changed. It wasn't professional anymore, it was personal, utterly disappointed. What exactly happened here? She asked quietly. Michael shifted his weight uneasily. Nothing serious. I almost pitied him then, because for the first time all evening I saw uncertainty in his eyes, the kind of uncertainty wealthy people feel when power begins to quietly slide away from them. Sophia turned to the restaurant manager. Clear out the private dining room, she said firmly. Michael's brow furrowed immediately. What? The manager hesitated. But the investors with the gentleman over there are still. I heard you, Sophia interrupted sharply. The manager nodded nervously and hurried away. Michael stared at her in disbelief. You can't just disrupt my dinner. Sophia finally looked directly at him, and her next words shifted the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. Yes, she said calmly, I can. The silence that followed Sophia's words felt almost violent. Michael stared at her as if he truly believed he had misheard. Around us, the chatter of the entire restaurant slowed to a crawl. Wealthy diners pretended not to watch while looking intently anyway. That's how wealthy people are. They avoid scenes publicly but feast on them privately. Michael forced a rigid chuckle. Sophia, I think there's been some sort of mistake. No, she replied evenly, I don't think there has. For the first time tonight I saw real unease on my son's face, not embarrassment, fear. Sophia turned back to me. Mrs. Martinez, would you prefer to move somewhere more comfortable? The kindness in her voice contrasted so sharply with Michael's cruelty that my chest tightened painfully. I'm fine here, I said softly. But she shook her head immediately. No, ma'am, you are not. The manager hurried back over, looking nervous. Should we prepare the executive suite? The executive suite. The words clearly confused the few investors nearby. Michael blinked rapidly. What executive suite? Sophia ignored him again. Yes, she told the manager, immediately. As the staff hurried away, Michael stepped closer to her. Sophia, he whispered harshly, what the hell is going on? She finally looked at him, and there was no warmth left in her eyes. I think, she said carefully, that is a question you should be asking your mother. Michael turned slowly toward me. For a moment nobody spoke, not Vanessa, not Richard Coleman, not even Emma. The entire room seemed suspended in the tension, and suddenly against my will memories began to rush back, not of tonight but of years ago, of the life Michael had worked so hard to erase. When he was a little boy, we lived in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in San Antonio. The walls would shake every time the industrial washers downstairs went into a spin cycle. The summers were unbearable because the window unit barely worked, and in the winter, we used the oven for heat more times than I care to admit. But Michael laughed constantly back then. He didn't care about money. He cared about baseball cards, cartoons, and whether I tucked him in at night. Carlos worked construction during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. Sometimes he would come home so exhausted he'd fall asleep right in the kitchen chair, still wearing his boots. But no matter how tired he was, he always kissed my forehead first. Then on a rainy October afternoon, everything changed. Carlos collapsed at work, a heart attack, 47 years old. He was gone before I even reached the hospital. I can still hear the sound Michael made when I told him. It's the kind of sound a mother never forgets. After the funeral, life became about pure survival. I cleaned motel rooms by day, washed dishes at a diner by night, and spent weekends caretaking for elderly patients. I didn't sleep a full night for nearly 6 years. There were nights my hands bled from the cleaning chemicals, but I still made sure Michael's school lunches were ready before sunrise, because I refused to let him feel different from the other kids. I wanted him to dream bigger than poverty, and he did, maybe too big. Michael won scholarships, went to college, entered the hospitality industry, made connections, and learned how wealthy people talked, dressed, and acted. At first I was proud. But slowly something changed. He stopped bringing friends home. He stopped mentioning his background. He stopped introducing me at company events unless it was absolutely unavoidable. The first time I realized he was ashamed of me, he was 28. I still remember it clearly. He had just started dating Vanessa. They came to my house for dinner, and when I went to take out the trash, I spoke to an older neighbor in Spanish. Later that night, Michael quietly said to me, "Mom, maybe don't do that around Vanessa's family." I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. He wasn't. "Why?" I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking embarrassed. "They're just different." Different, a word that seems so harmless yet carries so much shame. That was the beginning. After that, Michael became obsessed with how I fit into his world. He bought me a slightly nicer dress once, not out of generosity, but because he said my wardrobe made me look older than I was. He tried to convince me to move to a retirement community further out of the city, not because it was safer, but because he didn't want clients accidentally seeing where I lived. At first I made excuses for him. Stress, work, success changes people. But deep down I knew the truth. Michael hated poverty so much that eventually he began to hate everything that reminded him of it, including me. And yet I still loved him, because mothers are strange creatures. We keep watering dead gardens, hoping something will bloom again. "Mrs. Martinez." Sophia's voice brought me back to reality. I blinked rapidly. "Yes, the room is ready." I nodded slowly, standing up from the tiny table by the kitchen. But this time the attitude of the entire restaurant staff was completely different. Servers moved aside respectfully. Managers stood up straight, looking anxious. Even the hostess from earlier looked pale. Michael noticed. "What is all this?" he demanded under his breath. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "You told me your mother was barely getting by." The accusation in her voice made Michael snap back defensively. "She is." Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she said calmly, "she is not." Richard Coleman now stood up from the private table, curiosity getting the better of his manners. "Well," he said cautiously, "I think someone needs to explain exactly what is going on here." Sophia looked at me first, silently asking for permission. I hesitated, not because I was afraid of the truth, but because once the truth is spoken, relationships can rarely remain the same. But I gave a small nod anyway. Sophia turned back to face Richard. "Mrs. Evelyn Martinez," she said in a professional tone, "is the absolute majority shareholder of the Mark Hotel Group." A dead silence fell over the room. One of the investors actually let out a short laugh of pure disbelief. "What?" Michael stared at her blankly. "No," he said immediately, "that's impossible." But no one was looking at him anymore. They were all looking at me. Richard blinked several times. "The Mark Group owns this restaurant." "Yes," Sophia replied. Vanessa's face went completely pale. Michael slowly shook his head. No, that's impossible." I almost pitied him right then. For the first time in his adult life, my son was realizing a devastating truth. He had never actually known his mother. Sophia continued carefully. "Mrs. Martinez has held the controlling interest through a family trust structure for years." Michael turned to me, visibly shaken. "You own this place?" His voice sounded small now, almost like a little boy's. I met his gaze calmly. "I own far more than just this place." The words hit him like a physical blow. Emma stared at me with wide eyes, a mix of confusion and adoration. Grandma. I gave her a bittersweet smile. Richard Coleman slowly loosened his tie. Well, he murmured, this dinner just became very interesting. But Michael wasn't listening anymore. The very foundation of his identity was beginning to crumble, and deep down I think he knew the worst was yet to come. After Sophia revealed the truth, the entire energy of the restaurant seemed to shift around me. It wasn't a loud shift but a quiet, heavy one, as if gravity itself had changed direction. Just minutes ago, I was the poor old woman hidden away by the kitchen. Now the servers stood up straighter when they looked at me. Managers whispered urgently into their earpieces. The investors who had completely ignored my existence suddenly couldn't stop staring. Money changes the way people hear your voice, even if the voice itself has never changed. Michael looked pale. It wasn't embarrassment anymore, it was total panic. You're lying, he said to Sophia, though his voice lacked any real conviction. There's no way my mother owns the controlling stake in the Mark Hotel Group. Sophia remained perfectly composed. I assure you, Mr. Martinez, I would never joke about the corporate structure of this company. Vanessa slowly turned to me. All traces of her previous condescension were entirely gone, replaced by confusion and fear. You never told us any of this, she whispered. I met her eyes calmly. You never asked. The silence that followed was heavier than any loud argument. Richard Coleman stepped forward, his businessman instincts fully awake. Mrs. Martinez, he said cautiously, pardon my bluntness, but if this is true, why on earth do you still live the way you do? I almost smiled at that. Wealthy people always ask the same thing. Why not spend it as if money only exists to be flaunted? I folded my hands in front of me, because I know what it feels like to have absolutely nothing. No one spoke, even Michael seemed stunned by the answer. The truth was simple. Growing up with almost nothing meant that wealth never impressed me the way it did everyone else. Expensive things made Michael feel powerful, but they never made me feel safe. Only love could do that. Unfortunately, love is also the one thing money can't buy back once it's lost. Sophia pointed toward the nearby executive suite. Mrs. Martinez, perhaps we should continue this conversation in private. Michael stepped forward immediately. Yes, he said quickly, great idea. But Sophia stopped him with a single look. You aren't invited. The words landed like a slap. A few investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vanessa gasped, and for the first time in years I saw my son completely speechless. Emma quietly nudged closer to me. Grandma, she whispered, are you okay? I gently stroked her cheek. I will be, sweetheart. Unlike the adults in the room, Emma's care came with no hidden motives. That alone almost broke my heart all over again. As Sophia guided me toward the executive suite, I heard Richard stop Michael behind us. Hold on, Richard said firmly. I think I deserve an explanation. Michael lowered his voice in frustration. This is a family matter. No, Richard replied. The moment corporate ownership enters the conversation, it becomes a business matter. I didn't look back, but I heard the panic beginning to creep beneath Michael's restrained tone. Deep down, I realized something painful. My son wasn't afraid of hurting me. He was terrified of losing his status. The executive suite looked completely different from the rest of the restaurant. The lighting was softer, the chairs far more luxurious. Private wine cellars lined the walls. A modern chandelier hung above a long, polished dining table, and that light fixture alone probably cost more than my first apartment. Sophia pulled out a chair for me herself. The gesture made me slightly self-conscious. You don't have to do that, I said. No, she replied gently, I do. The moment the door closed behind us, the noise from the restaurant vanished. For the first time all evening there was a sense of quiet, true quiet. Sophia sat across from me carefully. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I should have known. True guilt colored her voice. I shook my head gently. How could you have known? Still, she looked deeply troubled. When Mr. Whitman called, I came as fast as I could. At the mention of Harold's name, I nodded slowly. He's probably on his way. Sophia hesitated before speaking again. I never imagined Michael would treat you that way. Neither did I, at least. I didn't think he would do it so openly. I looked down at my wine-stained dress, smoothing the fabric with my fingers. He's been ashamed of me for a very long time, I admitted quietly. Saying it out loud was more painful than I had anticipated. Sophia looked sad, but why? I almost laughed, because the answer was both complicated and painfully simple. Michael spent his whole life trying to run away from poverty, I said. Eventually, he started viewing anything connected to it as the enemy, including me. Sophia lowered her eyes briefly. My father was like that after he became successful. I looked up. She smiled wistfully. He changed his accent, changed how he dressed, and stopped talking to certain relatives entirely. She paused. Sometimes people think success means erasing their past. Her words landed heavily between us because she understood. Through the glass wall, I could still see the motion in the restaurant. Michael was packing, Vanessa was arguing with him in a low whisper, and Richard was talking to the other investors. Everything looked incredibly fragile now, like a perfect picture starting to crack down the middle. A soft knock broke the silence. The door opened and Harold Whitman walked in. Even at 72 years old, Harold carried himself with sharp authority. Grey suit, perfect posture, and calm eyes that missed nothing. The moment he saw the stain on my dress, his expression darkened. He did this. I turned my face away slightly. Harold let out a deep sigh. I warned Carlos that this day would come eventually. Hearing my husband's name made my chest tighten immediately. Harold stepped forward and gently kissed my forehead. Are you all right? I answered honestly, and it seemed to pain him. Harold had known Michael since the day he was born. He had been at his birthday parties, his graduations, and family holidays. He had loved my son deeply too, but tonight something had changed for him as well. He carefully placed a thick leather folder on the table. Sophia glanced at it knowingly, and suddenly my stomach knotted with anxiety, because now this was becoming real, irreversible. Harold sat quietly beside me. You still have time to back out, he said softly. I knew what he meant. I could leave tonight. Pretend none of this happened. Keep protecting Michael from any consequences, just like I always had. Sometimes that's what mothers do. We mistake protection for love. But then I remembered his face when he said those words. You are too poor to be sitting here. It wasn't anger, it was shame. It was as if I disgusted him. Suddenly, something settled inside me. No, I whispered. Harold studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. He opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, financial statements, ownership structures, and trust agreements. It was the invisible foundation supporting Michael's entire business empire, and he still had no idea how deep his life really went. Sophia looked toward the door. They're asking to come in. Of course they were. The moment money is involved, wealthy people always want answers. Harold adjusted his glasses calmly. Then I suppose, he said quietly, it's time your son finally learns the truth. Somehow, hearing that made me feel afraid, almost as much as Michael was about to be, because no matter what happened next, our family would never go back to the way it was. The knock on the executive suite door sounded incredibly formal, like the start of a legal hearing rather than a family conversation. Sophia took one last look at me. Are you ready? No, not even close. But I nodded anyway, because some truths are too heavy to carry forever. Sophia opened the door. Michael was the first to walk in. His expensive suit still looked flawless, but the confidence inside it was beginning to collapse. Vanessa followed closely behind, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Richard Coleman came in next, along with two senior investors whose expressions had shifted from amused to concerned. Emma slipped into the room last. Without hesitation, she walked straight to my side. That alone almost brought me to tears. No one spoke at first. Harold calmly closed the leather folder in front of him and took off his glasses. Michael looked between everyone impatiently. Can someone please explain what the hell is going on here? His tone held irritation, not regret, even now. Harold answered him before anyone else could. What is happening, he stated calmly, is that you are learning a few things your father intended for you to understand when the time was right. Michael frowned. What does this have to do with my dad? At the mention of Carlos, the room seemed to grow even quieter, because despite all of Michael's success beneath the surface, he still carried a deep wound from losing his father. Harold folded his hands carefully. Before Carlos Martinez passed away, he established several investment structures designed to protect his family long-term. Michael let out a dismissive scoff. "My dad was a construction worker." "No," Harold corrected gently. "Your father was a very intelligent man who happened to work in construction." The distinction mattered. I saw Richard glance at Michael briefly. Wealthy people respect intelligence even when it's hidden. Harold opened the folder again, sliding several documents across the polished table. "These are copies of the original partnership agreements your father signed 24 years ago." Michael didn't even look at them. "What partnership agreements?" I closed my eyes briefly as memories rushed back. Late nights with Carlos sitting at our tiny kitchen table, surrounded by papers, numbers, calculators, and business plans. At the time, one of Carlos's best friends was a chef named Alejandro Mark. Alejandro dreamed of opening a small family restaurant, but couldn't secure financing because no one believed a working-class Hispanic man from South Texas could build a successful brand. Except Carlos, he believed fully. So he invested almost all of our savings. At the time, I thought he was out of his mind. We were barely getting by ourselves, but Carlos kept repeating the same thing: people always underestimate quiet men. After Carlos passed away, Alejandro continued to grow the business slowly. One restaurant became 3, 3 became 10, then came hotels, luxury partnerships, and corporate acquisitions. Eventually, the Mark Hotel Group became one of the fastest-growing hospitality companies in the Southwest. And through every expansion, our ownership was protected, quietly, privately. Harold tapped a document carefully. "Your father retained the controlling family shares before he passed." Michael stared blankly. "That's impossible." "It is a matter of record." Vanessa finally spoke up. "So Evelyn inherited all of this?" Harold nodded. "Yes." The room fell into a dead silence again. Michael let out a scoff from his throat. It was a nervous sound. "No," he muttered. "No, that doesn't make sense. If my mother had this kind of money, why would she live like—" He caught himself, but it was too late. "Like what? A poor, embarrassing old woman." I answered him softly before anyone else could. "Because your father and I knew what it felt like to go hungry." Michael looked at me helpless. "You could have lived anywhere, done anything." I already had everything I wanted. The words were quiet, but they landed heavily, because once upon a time my family really had been enough for me. Harold slid another stack of papers across the table. "These," he said calmly, "concern the Martinez family trust." Richard leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "This exact trust funded your acquisition of your first hotel property," Harold continued. Michael froze completely. "What?" "The seed money you used for your hotel expansion was injected through investment channels managed under your mother's authorization," Harold explained, adjusting his glasses. Michael stared at him. "No, I built my company myself." His voice sounded smaller now, somehow more vulnerable. "You built it," Harold remained composed, "but you used opportunities your mother silently secured for you behind the scenes." The statement was far more damaging than anger. I watched my son's face as his entire identity began to unravel. Michael's entire public persona was built on a single story: the self-made success, the poor kid who rose to the top alone, the businessman who needed no one. And now that story was completely shattered in front of his investors, his wife, his daughter, and everyone else. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. "So the funding actually came from family capital." "Protected family capital," Harold clarified. Michael looked at me, his eyes burning with resentment. "You lied to me." The accusation strung. "I was protecting you." "That is not the same thing," his voice echoed sharply in the room. Emma flinched beside me. I stared at my son in disbelief. "What did you want me to protect you from, Michael?" "From becoming entirely consumed by money." Silence fell over the room again, because deep down everyone knew I had failed. Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Well, that worked out wonderfully." Harold's tone hardened slightly for the first time. "Your mother spent years ensuring you could succeed on your own merits." "I did succeed." Yes, Harold replied quietly, but you didn't do it alone. Vanessa slowly sat down in a chair. You told everyone you grew up with absolutely nothing. I did have nothing, Michael fired back defensively. I looked at him sadly. No, I said softly, you grew up with parents who sacrificed everything just so you would never have to feel poor. His gaze flicked to me. For a brief second, guilt appeared, but pride crushed it once again. Richard now began to question carefully. So Evelyn controls the trust? Yes, Harold answered. And the hospitality group? Yes. Richard slowly loosened his tie completely. Good grief. Michael suddenly stood up from his chair and began to pace. This is completely insane. No one interrupted him. I worked so hard for so many years, he continued angrily. So many years, you let me believe I earned all of this on my own. You did earn it, I said softly, but you forgot who carried you when you couldn't walk on your own. He stopped packing. For the first time all evening, pain rather than arrogance crossed his face. Real pain. I spent my entire childhood feeling ashamed, he admitted in a whisper. Do you know what it feels like to watch wealthy kids laugh at your clothes, your house, your accent? My chest tightened because suddenly I understood. I wasn't seeing the cruel businessman anymore. I was seeing the hurt little boy hidden inside him. I wanted you to have more, I murmured. You made me feel weak. No, I replied sadly. The world made you feel weak. I just loved you through it. Emma's eyes welled with tears beside me. Even Vanessa looked shaken now. But Michael's expression hardened once again. Then he asked the question that changed everything. How much control does she actually have over my company? No one answered at first. Harold slowly closed the folder. Then he looked directly at Michael. Enough, he weighed his words carefully, to reverse everything. Suddenly, the room didn't feel like a family dinner anymore. It felt like the beginning of a legal battle. After Harold said those words, the atmosphere in the room completely changed, enough to reverse everything. No one moved, no one even touched the untouched wine on the table. The air had become too heavy for luxury. Michael stood frozen at the far end of the room, one hand on his hip, the other aggressively running through his hair. For the first time in years, he didn't look like a powerful businessman. He looked like a panicked kid trying to figure out why the ground had suddenly vanished beneath his feet. Vanessa was the first to speak. What exactly does that mean? She asked cautiously. Harold remained calm. It means Mrs. Martinez holds absolute veto power over several holding structures directly tied to Michael's hotel expansions. Richard Coleman slowly leaned forward. And you never disclosed this. The question isn't for me, it's for Michael. My son swallowed hard. I didn't know. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. But you represented to us that you were entirely self-funded. I believed I was. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. In business, perception is often as important as reality, and tonight, Michael's carefully crafted image was falling apart piece by piece. One of the white-haired investors, a man named Preston Hale, finally spoke. He looked at Harold. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. The seed capital was provided through family trust channels controlled by Evelyn Martinez, correct? And Michael had no knowledge of this. Is that true? Preston slowly leaned back. That is a significant disclosure issue. The word landed heavily. Michael noticed immediately. What is that supposed to mean? Richard answered for him this time. It means investors don't like surprises, Michael. I didn't lie. Vanessa suddenly let out a laugh. It wasn't kind or warm, it was entirely bitter. You absolutely lied. Everyone turned to look at her. For years, Vanessa had protected Michael in public, defended him, admired him, and built her social standing around his success. But tonight, something inside her had broken too. You told everyone you built your empire from scratch, she continued coldly. You packaged your childhood into an inspirational corporate story. Michael's jaw tightened, because it was hard. No one is saying it wasn't, she fired back without hesitation, but that is not the same as doing it completely alone. Emma sat quietly beside me, squeezing my hand tighter. I could feel her shaking slightly. It's always the children who suffer when adults turn love into a power struggle. Suddenly, I hated every second of this. Not because Michael didn't deserve to face consequences, but because beneath all this ugliness he was still my son. The little boy who used to kiss my cheek before school, the teenager who cried after his first heartbreak, the young man who promised his dying father he would look after me. Where did that person go? Michael turned to me suddenly. You knew this would ruin me. His voice was entirely accusatory now. I stared at him in disbelief. Ruin you? Yes, he gestured angrily around the room. You deliberately waited until I was in front of my investors to reveal this. The injustice of the statement left me speechless. Then Harold spoke before I could. No, he said sternly. Your mother came here tonight believing her son wanted to reconnect with her. Michael looked away. Because he knew it was the truth, Harold continued. She didn't create this situation, Michael, you did. Silence, a painful, heavy silence. Then Richard cleared his throat gently. There's another issue here. Everyone looked at him. His expression had become much more serious now. Michael, he said slowly, you have repeatedly described your operation as financially independent from family influence to our board. Michael rubbed his forehead, because I thought it was. Legally that may not matter, Richard replied, but ethically it changes things considerably. I watched panic begin to creep across my son's face. Not guilt, panic, because Michael now understood something terrifying. His reputation, the thing he valued above almost everything else, was beginning to fracture. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. What else don't I know? Michael suddenly looked exhausted. Vanessa, please. No, her eyes were filled with tears now. You described your mother as an incapable old woman who couldn't manage her life. I lowered my eyes immediately, because hearing those words said out loud hurt more than I had anticipated. Vanessa's face twisted with frustration. You told people she was financially strapped because she couldn't manage money. Michael said nothing. The silence answered everything. Richard studied him carefully now. Was any of that true? Michael finally snapped. Why is everyone suddenly so concerned about my mother? The air in the room froze, because sometimes the truth slips out in anger, and the truth that slipped from Michael's mouth was ugly. Everything I have I worked for, he continued harshly. No one handed me success. I stood up from my chair slowly. The movement immediately silenced the room. My hands were shaking slightly, but my voice remained calm. Yes, I said softly, nothing was handed to you. Michael stared at me, frustration burning in his eyes. You don't understand the battles I went through to get here. I smiled sadly. Oh, Michael, my chest ached painfully. Every scar on your hands is from climbing upward. I paused, but every scar on my hands is from holding the ladder steady while you did. The room fell into a dead silence. Emma quietly cried beside me. Even Richard looked deeply uncomfortable now, because the difference between sacrifice and ambition had suddenly become painfully clear. Michael looked away first. That said everything. Sophia, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. There is one more matter that needs to be discussed. Harold gave her a knowing look. Michael looked irritated again. What now? Sophia folded her hands carefully. Recently, several expense reports tied to your executive accounts caught our attention. Michael froze. It was just a fraction of a second, but I noticed it. Harold noticed it too. What kind of attention? Richard asked sharply. Sophia hesitated before answering. Luxury spending categorized as hotel development projects. Michael shook his head immediately. That's standard business practice. Private jet trips for vacations, Sophia asked calmly. Michael's face hardened. Networking trips, designer shopping reimbursed through vendor entertainment budgets. Vanessa turned to him slowly. What? Michael looked cornered now. Everyone does it. Richard's expression turned cold instantly. No, he said sternly, everyone does not do it. The energy in the room shifted once again, this time from a family conflict to a corporate crisis. Harold slowly reopened the leather folder. Inside were additional documents even I hadn't seen yet. My stomach tightened, because suddenly I realized how much Harold had been quietly monitoring behind the scenes. Michael noticed the folder too. For the first time all evening, real fear entered his eyes. What's in there? He whispered. Harold adjusted his glasses. Information. Michael stepped forward aggressively. What information? Harold didn't flinch. Information that becomes very important when someone confuses corporate funds with personal lifestyle maintenance. Vanessa stared at her husband. Michael. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His breathing had changed. It was rapid, shallow, because deep down he already knew what was coming. I knew it too. The worst part wasn't discovering that my son had become arrogant. It wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't even the cruelty. It was realizing how long he had been building a life entirely dependent on appearances, and how terrified he was of anyone seeing the truth beneath them. Then Harold closed the folder again calmly, and with a single sentence he pushed the evening into a much darker place. There are clauses in the trust, he stated quietly, specifically designed for situations like this. Michael slowly looked up. What situations? Harold met his gaze. When character becomes a liability. When character becomes a liability. Harold's words hung over the room like a dark cloud. Michael stared at him in disbelief. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Harold remained absolutely composed, which somehow made it feel worse. It means your father understood something a long time ago, even before you became successful. Michael crossed his arms defensively. What? Money only exposes who a person truly is, Harold replied calmly. It doesn't change them. No one spoke after that. Not Vanessa, not Richard, not Emma, because deep down everyone in this room was now asking the same question: who had Michael truly become? Harold slowly reopened the leather folder, pulling out a small, neatly clipped stack of papers. The Martinez family trust contains conduct protection clauses. Michael let out a sharp scoff. You've got to be kidding me. I am not. Harold slid the papers down the table toward him. Your father insisted on them personally. Michael didn't touch the documents. This is ridiculous. Actually, Richard muttered under his breath, it's incredibly smart. Michael ignored him. Harold adjusted his glasses and continued. The trust stipulates that if the primary beneficiary engages in financial misconduct, abuse of corporate resources, or actions deemed damaging to the family's reputable standing, the controlling stakes can be legally reverted to the trust holder. Michael stared blankly, then he slowly looked at me. The trust holder is, Mom. Yes, Harold answered. My stomach knotted tightly. Even though I had known about these clauses for years, hearing them read out loud felt entirely surreal, because Carlos had never put them there out of a lack of trust. He had done it out of fear that success would someday consume our son. And now here we were. Michael finally grabbed the documents roughly, scanning the first page. This is completely insane, he muttered. No, Harold corrected, it is legally binding. Vanessa stepped closer. Financial misconduct, her voice sounded much smaller now, cautious. Michael shook his head immediately. There is no misconduct. Sophia stepped forward calmly. That depends on how the board interprets several expenditures currently under review. Michael glared at her. You've been auditing me. No, Sophia replied evenly. The accounting department flagged irregularities. Richard's expression turned dark instantly. What irregularities? Michael rubbed his face in frustration. Oh my God, this is entirely blown out of proportion. Harold calmly pulled another sheet from the folder. Private resort fees charged to hotel expansions. Michael looked away immediately. Client relationship development, luxury vehicles leased through operating subsidiaries. Brand representation. Private vacations categorized as executive retreats. Michael's silence answered everything. Vanessa stared at him. You used company money for vacations. It wasn't illegal. That wasn't the question. Her voice cracked slightly. For the first time all evening I saw genuine hurt in her eyes. It wasn't about the money, it was about the lies. Michael threw the papers onto the table violently. Everyone in business does this. Richard stood up abruptly. No, he barked coldly, reputable people do not. The room fell silent again. I looked at my son carefully. His breathing was shallow and fast, aggressive yet desperate. Suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. Michael still didn't truly understand why tonight mattered. He thought it was about money, about control, about embarrassment, but it wasn't. It was about dignity, my dignity, and perhaps underneath it all his own. Emma quietly nudged closer to me. "Grandma," she whispered, "are they going to put Daddy in jail?" The innocence in her voice nearly broke me. I squeezed her hand gently. "No, sweetheart, at least I hope not." Michael looked up at me suddenly, anger burning behind his eyes. "Are you really going to do this?" The accusation hurt, not because he was angry, but because even now he refused to look at his own role in all of this. I stared at him calmly. "You humiliated me tonight, so now you're going to ruin my life." "No," my voice trembled slightly for the first time. "You broke something yourself tonight, Michael." For a fraction of a second, emotion flickered across his face again, but arrogance consumed it almost immediately. He looked at Harold. "So what happens now? My mother takes my company away." "No," Harold replied quietly. "That company was never entirely yours to begin with." The statement hit harder than anything else tonight. Michael physically recoiled slightly, because for a man who placed his entire identity in achievement, ownership mattered more than love. Vanessa suddenly stood up from her chair. "I need to step out." Without waiting for anyone to answer, she walked quickly toward the door. Emma watched her mother leave, looking torn. "Go with her," I whispered gently. But Emma shook her head. "No," then she added softly, "I want to stay with you." The words broke something inside me, because children always go toward the person who makes them feel safest, and tonight that person wasn't Michael. Richard loosened his tie again, looking at Harold. "If these clauses are enacted, what happens operationally?" Michael whipped around. "You aren't seriously considering this." Richard ignored him. Harold answered in a professional tone. "A suspension of executive authority, pending a full board review of the finances." Michael stared at him. "This is absurd." "Actually," Sophia replied quietly, "given the financial concerns, it may be unavoidable." I watched it happen. The exact moment panic completely replaced the arrogance in my son's eyes. The color drained from his face entirely. "You can't do this to me." Harold folded his hands. "No one wanted it to come to this, Michael." "You think I wanted this?" His voice cracked loudly now. The mask of the perfect businessman had finally shattered completely. "I spent my entire life trying to never feel as powerless as we did when I was a kid." The air in the room froze because his anger was finally mixed with pain, real pain. He pointed at me emotionally. "You think poverty is honorable? No, it's humiliating." My chest tightened painfully. "I know." "No, you don't." Tears suddenly filled his eyes. "You didn't hear what people said about us." I stared at him in disbelief. "Michael, I lived through that too. But you were fine with it." That hurt more than everything else combined, because he still didn't understand. "I was never fine with struggling," I whispered. "I was only fine with us surviving together." A tear finally escaped, spilling down his face. A broken tear, the kind of tear a man like Michael spent years learning how to hide. "Do you know what it felt like to watch wealthy kids laugh at Dad's truck?" he said hoarsely. "Or to hear people make fun of your accent?" I closed my eyes briefly because yes, I remembered all of it. Every cruel comment, every slight, every closed door. But I also remembered what Michael had forgotten. The love. "We were never poor in the ways that mattered most," I murmured. Michael let out a bitter chuckle through his tears. "That's easy to say when you're the one without ambition." The room was painfully quiet. Even he seemed to realize the comment was too cruel. Emma looked horrified. "Dad." I lowered my eyes slowly. Strangely, the comment hurt even more than the humiliation in the restaurant earlier, because it came from a place of genuine truth inside him. Harold calmly closed the folder once again. "I think one thing has been made very clear tonight." Michael wiped his face roughly. "What's that?" Harold looked straight at him. "Your father worried that money would turn success into a sense of entitlement." Silence, then Harold added softly, "He may have been right." Michael looked at me in that moment, truly looked at me. For the first time all evening, I think he finally saw the hurt in my eyes. Not anger, not revenge, but heartbreak. And somehow, that seemed to terrify him more than losing his company. After Harold spoke his last words, No one said anything for several seconds. The silence now felt sharp and exhausting, as if the room itself was tired of holding so much disappointment. Michael stood entirely still by the table, pale, his eyes red from frustration and humiliation. For the first time all night he no longer looked large, he looked lost. Richard Coleman slowly gathered his documents and stood up. I think we should suspend all discussions regarding the expansion deal until this matter is properly reviewed. Michael snapped his head up. Richard, this is just a family disagreement. His tone was back to being professional, cold, formatted, the kind of tone investors use when emotions become inconvenient. The other investors stood up one by one as well. No one shouted, no one insulted Michael, but somehow their quiet distance felt much worse because a polite rejection can still cause a deep wound. Richard looked at me before leaving. In any case, Mrs. Martinez, I am very sorry for how this evening unfolded. I gave a small nod, thank you. Then he turned to Michael. You should go home, no, call me tomorrow, no, we'll sort this out, just go home. Michael watched helplessly as the investors walked out of the executive suite one after the other. Years of networking, years of image building, years of carefully constructing a reputation. And tonight, it was all beginning to slip through his fingers. Vanessa stood near the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked emotionally exhausted. You lied to me too, she whispered. Michael rubbed his forehead. Vanessa, please. No, her eyes were swimming with tears now. You let me believe your mother was financially irresponsible. I lowered my gaze again, because hearing those words out loud still caused a sharp ache. Vanessa slowly shook her head. She walked into this restaurant wearing patched shoes, sitting on enough wealth to buy half the building. I didn't know, Michael snapped back. But you enjoyed believing she was beneath you. The truth of the statement landed with incredible weight. Michael didn't answer because there was no answer to give. Emma finally stood up, walking carefully toward her father. Dad. Michael looked down at his daughter, and for a fraction of a second his entire expression softened. Hey, sweetheart. But Emma's eyes were full of tears. Why were you so mean to Grandma? The question was simple, pure, and entirely childlike. Somehow it was more devastating than anything Harold or the investors had said all night. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there is never a graceful excuse for cruelty, especially when explaining it to a child. Emma's voice trembled. She loves you so much. The phrase finally broke through whatever defense he had left. Michael sank heavily into the nearest chair, covering his face with both hands. The room fell silent once again. I watched my son quietly, remembering the countless times I had held him when he cried as a little boy, after nightmares, after getting bullied at school, after Carlos died. Back then he was always willing to accept comfort. Somewhere along the way he had learned to view love as a vulnerability. That might actually be the greatest tragedy of all. Harold slowly stood up. I'll leave the two of you alone for a moment. Sophia nodded, following him toward the exit. Vanessa hesitated briefly before leaving, though she gently took Emma's hand to lead her out. You can stay if you want, I told Emma softly. But she looked at her mother and shook her head. No, it's okay. She followed her mother outside reluctantly. Suddenly the executive suite felt incredibly empty, leaving just Michael and me. A mother and a son. There were no more illusions left to hide behind. For a long while neither of us said a word. Michael finally lowered his hands from his face. His eyes looked exhausted. Somehow he seemed so much older. You should have told me. I was almost amused by the irony. Told you what? That we aren't. He struggled to find the right words. That we aren't those kinds of people anymore. I stared at him calmly. What kind of people? The poor, pitiable family that everyone looks down on. My chest tightened painfully. Michael, we were never people who needed pity. Yes, we were. The bitterness in his voice surprised me. He stood up abruptly and began packing again. Do you have any idea what it felt like growing up, watching other kids get everything so easily? A nice house, vacations, new clothes. I know what it felt like to work myself to the bone trying to give you those things. He stopped walking. For a brief second, emotion flickered across his face, then his pride took over once more. You don't understand. No, I whispered sadly. I understand all too well. He shook his head. You try to romanticize being poor. I made survival dignified, Michael. That's a very different thing. I looked at him for a long time before asking the question that had weighed on my heart for years. When did you start being so ashamed of me? Michael froze. A flash of genuine fear entered his eyes because suddenly this wasn't a business crisis anymore. This was deeply personal. Painfully personal. I was never ashamed of you, he defended himself weakly. Yes, you were. He looked away, and his silence became his confession. Tears welled up in my eyes again, though I fought to keep them back. I spent years wondering what I did wrong. Maybe I talked too much, maybe I didn't dress right, maybe I embarrassed you without realizing it, but tonight, my voice cracked. Tonight you looked at me like I was something disposable, like I was beneath you. The anguish deepened on his face. Good, maybe he was finally feeling a fraction of the weight I had carried for so long. I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? He couldn't answer. Cruelty rarely holds up under honest scrutiny. Michael slowly sat back down, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He swallowed hard. I worked so hard to build a completely different life. I used to be proud of you, I just didn't want people to see where I came from. Finally, the truth came out. No sugarcoating, no corporate excuses, just the raw, painful, honest truth. I closed my eyes briefly. When your father was facing his final days, I said softly, his greatest fear wasn't poverty. Michael slowly raised his head. It was losing you. The room became painfully quiet. He worried that success would turn your heart cold. Michael's jaw tightened. Do you think I'm heartless? No, I looked at him wistfully. I think you became afraid of any love that didn't elevate your status. The realization hit him hard. I could see it in his eyes. Deep down he knew it was true. For years he had kept his distance from me. He called it ambition, but in reality it was fear. Fear of being that boy from the struggling neighborhood again. Fear of showing vulnerability. Fear of being ordinary. Michael suddenly looked completely drained. What happens now? The question made him sound almost like a child again. I stared at my son calmly. Despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation and the cruelty, a part of me still wanted to protect him. That is the heavy reality of being a mother. Love doesn't simply vanish because someone hurts you. Sometimes the fact that the love remains is what hurts the most. I don't know, I answered honestly. Michael looked down at the table. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he whispered, I didn't think tonight would end this way. Neither did I when I left San Antonio that morning. I thought my son was taking me out for dinner. I never imagined I would actually be attending the funeral of the relationship we used to have. When Michael and I walked out of the executive suite, the restaurant no longer seemed glamorous. It felt exposed. It was as if all the elaborate luxury had been stripped away, leaving behind something incredibly cold. The investors were gone. Most of the other guests had returned to their meals, but I could still feel curious glances following us through the room. Wealthy people always pretend not to look, but when a shift in power happens publicly, they always watch. Michael walked beside me in silence. It wasn't his usual confident silence. This was heavy, weighed down by humiliation and defeat. Vanessa was standing near the entrance, holding Emma's hand. Her makeup was still perfect, but her eyes were swollen from crying. I never expected to see Vanessa Martinez look unsure of anything. The moment she saw Michael, she straightened up. What did Harold say? Michael didn't answer right away. How do you summarize the collapse of your entire identity in a single sentence? Basically, he muttered, the board is reviewing everything. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. And the investors? He looked away. That was answer enough. Emma quietly stepped toward me again. Grandma, are you leaving? I gently stroked her hair. Soon, sweetheart. Can I come visit you this weekend? Before I could even answer, Vanessa surprised us all. Yes, she said softly. I think that would be really good. Michael snapped his head up, but Vanessa ignored him. She looked directly at me. I owe you an apology. Saying those words clearly hurt her pride, but unlike Michael, she said them anyway. I misjudged you, she continued quietly, and I believed things I shouldn't have. I saw genuine regret in her expression. It wasn't a perfect understanding, but it was real enough. I gave her a gentle nod. Thank you. Michael suddenly let out a sharp, frustrated breath. So now everyone is turning against me. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. Is that really your only takeaway from tonight? He ran his hands through his hair again, packing back and forth near the front doors. My entire company is on the line, and your mother. Vanessa snapped. Did you consider her for even 1 second tonight? Michael looked utterly defeated. I said things I shouldn't have, but you humiliated her in public and she humiliated me. The moment those words left his mouth, Emma broke down. Stop it, she cried out. The entire lobby went dead silent. Emma looked at her father, her young face filled with heartbreak. She's your mum. The words cut deeper than any shout. Michael looked stunned, not because Emma was wrong, but because children have a way of stripping adults down to the absolute truth. Vanessa immediately placed a protective arm around Emma. Let's go, sweetie. But Emma stubbornly shook her head. No, her eyes remained fixed on Michael. You made Grandma cry. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it because there was no defense left. None at all. In that moment, a painful realization washed over me. This night would stay with Emma forever. Long after the business meetings were over and the financial fallout settled, she would remember the moment love failed so publicly. And tonight, Michael had failed terribly. Harold quietly stepped up behind us, holding the leather folder. The car is waiting outside, Evelyn. I nodded. A part of me desperately wanted to go home, to leave Dallas behind and crawl back into my quiet little house where nothing glamorous ever happened, and no one looked at me with disappointment. But another part of me couldn't stop looking at my son, because despite everything, he looked entirely broken. Sophia walked up right behind him. Michael. He raised his head tiredly. The board will be meeting Monday morning. His face tensed immediately. That soon? Yes. Michael let out a low, bitter chuckle. Of course. Sophia's tone softened slightly. I tried to push it back. That surprised him and it surprised me too. Michael looked at her confused. Why? Because despite what happened tonight, she paused carefully, I still remember who you used to be. Something broke in his expression again, and suddenly I realized something vital. I wasn't the only one grieving the person Michael had become. Everyone who knew him before his success felt it too. Michael leaned weakly against the wall near the entrance. I can fix this. But no one answered, because deep down we all understood the reality. This was no longer just about numbers, investors, or expense reports. This was about character, trust, and love, and those things don't recover as quickly as stock values. Vanessa finally spoke again, her voice much quieter this time. Do you know what the worst part is, Michael? He looked at her. You actually made me believe you were ashamed of being poor. His jaw tightened. I was. No, her eyes welled with tears again. You were ashamed of the people who still loved you after you got money. The truth of those words seemed to hit him physically. Good, maybe the pain was finally reaching the places pride had protected for too long. Emma slowly let go of Vanessa's hand and walked carefully toward Michael. For a second, he looked hopeful, as if she were coming to comfort him. Instead, she asked a quiet question. If Grandma was rich, would you have talked to her like that tonight? Michael froze completely. No one moved, no one even breathed, because sometimes children ask the exact questions adults spend years trying to avoid. Michael stared at his daughter helplessly, and once again he had no answer. Emma's eyes filled with tears. That's what scares me. Then she quietly walked back to my side, and I instinctively wrapped my arm around her shoulder. Michael looked completely broken now, utterly destroyed, but not because of the company or the investors. For the first time all evening, he was finally seeing himself through someone else's eyes. And he didn't like what he saw. Outside the restaurant windows, a heavy rain began to fall over downtown Dallas. The city lights blurred against the wet glass, and everything suddenly felt much colder. Harold took a quiet glance at his watch. We should get going. I nodded slowly, but before leaving I turned to Michael one last time. My son looked beyond exhausted. His tie was undone, his eyes were red, and his pride was completely shattered. Suddenly, I remembered him at 12 years old, right after he lost his first baseball championship. He had cried the entire ride home in the car because he believed letting people down meant they would stop loving him. I told him something that night, something I wasn't sure he remembered anymore. Failure doesn't make you unlovable, Michael, cruelty does. I looked at him calmly now. For the first time since I arrived in Dallas, Michael actually looked terrified, not of losing his money, but of losing us. Mom, his voice cracked heavily. I stopped in my tracks. Just that word almost broke me, because no matter how old he got when he was hurting, he still sounded like my little boy. I never wanted things to turn out like this, he whispered. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it all. People rarely intend to become cruel. They just make so many small, selfish choices that eventually, cruelty becomes second nature. Tears blurred my vision once more. I know. Michael swallowed hard. Please don't take everything away from me. The room fell into a final silence, and deep down, I realized my next choice would determine whether this family had any future at all. Please don't take everything away from me. Michael's voice barely sounded like his own anymore. There was no more carefully rehearsed confidence, no more arrogance. All that remained was fear, raw, desperate fear. The rain continued to beat against the glass outside, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement below. Around us, the staff pretended not to listen, but I knew everyone nearby could feel the heavy tension in the air. I looked at my son calmly. For years, I had imagined this moment in different ways. I had pictured confronting him, demanding answers, and making him understand how deeply his distance had hurt me. But now that the moment was here, I felt no sense of victory. I just felt tired, heartbroken, and older than I ever had before. Harold stepped up beside me carefully. Evelyn, he said softly, you don't have to make a decision tonight. But the truth was I already had, perhaps not a final one but enough for now. I looked at Michael. Do you think I want revenge? His gaze dropped immediately. No. But you think I want to punish you? He swallowed hard and didn't answer. The silence was enough. I took a deep breath. When your father set up those protection clauses in the trust, he wasn't trying to control you. Michael looked up. He was trying to protect you from becoming a man who measures human worth by status. Pain flickered across his face again, because he knew that was exactly what had happened to him. Vanessa stood near the entrance, holding Emma tightly, watching us silently. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa seemed stripped of her illusions too. No perfect social mask, no carefully maintained superiority, just exhaustion and perhaps regret. Michael rubbed his eyes with both hands. So what happens now? I glanced briefly at Harold before looking back at my son. You will step down from executive control temporarily. He snapped his head up. What? The board's review will happen on Monday, I continued calmly. You will cooperate fully. Panic flashed across his face once more. You're sidelining me, that company is my life. No, I said softly, it became your identity. Those are two very different things. The statement hit him heavily. He slowly shook his head. You can't just take away everything I built. I'm not taking it away. My voice finally found some steel. You nearly destroyed it yourself. Silence fell because deep down he knew I was right. Word of Richard's investors walking out tonight would spread quickly. Questions about corporate finances would travel even faster. And the story behind what happened tonight, that would travel fastest of all. Not because people care about morals, but because the wealthy love a scandal. Michael began to pace again, anger simmering beneath his panic. This is unbelievable. No, Vanessa said quietly. What's unbelievable is that your mother is still standing by you at all. Michael looked at her harshly. You're taking her side now. I'm taking the side of basic human decency. The exhaustion in her voice sounded completely real now. She looked at me briefly. I spent years thinking Evelyn was judging me. I blinked in surprise. Vanessa gave a bitter smile. You were always so quiet around me. I thought you disliked me. I never disliked you, Vanessa. She lowered her eyes. But I let Michael convince me that you were below us. The shame on her face made my heart ache unexpectedly. Arrogance is contagious. People pass it back and forth to one another, especially in circles where status becomes more important than character. Emma suddenly stepped away from Vanessa, walking toward Michael again. This time her voice sounded very small. Dad. Michael looked at her immediately. What is it, sweetie? Are you still rich? In any other situation, the question might have been amusing. Tonight, it sounded devastating. Michael stared at his daughter for several seconds before answering, "I don't know." Emma frowned slightly, then asked the one question none of us were prepared for. "If you lose all your money, will Grandma still love you?" Tears instantly spilled over my eyelashes. Michael looked completely undone, because finally someone had forced him to face the difference between wealth and love, and the person who had done it was his own child. "Yes," he whispered hoarsely. Emma nodded slowly. "Then why wasn't that enough for you?" No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes children can untangle emotional truths that adults spend decades making complicated. Michael slowly sat down in one of the lobby chairs, staring at the floor. "I don't even know how I became this person." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Harold folded his arms calmly. "It happens slowly, Michael." Michael looked up at him. "You knew?" Harold nodded once. "I suspected." "Then why didn't anyone tell me?" Harold's expression softened with sadness. "Someone tried, you just stopped listening." It was true. I thought of every phone call Michael had hurried off of, every holiday dinner cut short for networking opportunities, and every time he had subtly corrected my clothes, my accent, or my stories. None of it happened overnight. Cruelty rarely develops in a single day. It grows quietly in a sense of entitlement. Michael looked back at me suddenly. "What if I change?" The vulnerability in his voice almost broke me because, for the first time all evening, he sounded genuine. No defenses, no calculation, just fear. I walked over to him slowly. My son looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. Suddenly, I felt like I was looking at every version of him at once. The little boy, the grieving teenager, the ambitious young man, and the arrogant executive, all tangled up in a broken spirit. I gently touched his face, just as I used to do when he was small. "You can change, Michael," I whispered. He closed his eyes briefly, "but not while people keep saving you from the consequences." A tear slipped down his cheek. "I'm scared." There it was, the truth beneath all the ego. Fear. Fear of being powerless again, fear of being ordinary, and fear that if the success disappeared, the love would go with it. I smoothed his hair gently. "Your father was scared too." Michael looked up startled. "What, every single day?" I smiled sadly through my tears. He was terrified that he couldn't provide enough, terrified that you would suffer, and terrified that I deserved better. Michael stared at me in silence. "But do you know what made your father different?" He shook his head slightly. "He never treated another human being like garbage just because they had less." The tears were coming freely now. They weren't tears of anger anymore, they were tears of mourning. The kind of tears people cry when they realize they've become someone they don't recognize. I stepped back slowly. "You're going to lose your position for now." Michael nodded weakly. "You will cooperate with the investigation." He nodded again. "And you will rebuild trust honestly." His voice cracked this time. "How?" I looked at him for a long time. "By making one humble choice at a time." Outside, the rain finally began to ease. The storm was passing. Perhaps it meant something, or perhaps I just hoped it did. Harold glanced at his watch again quietly. "We should go, Evelyn." I nodded. This time when I turned toward the exit, Michael didn't stop me. He didn't argue or shout. He just sat there, looking completely drained as his entire life reshaped itself around him. Somehow, that was more frightening to see than his anger. A broken pride can be dangerous, but a shattered identity will either destroy a person or finally force them to rebuild into someone better. I just didn't know which path my son would choose yet. It was 3 weeks before I saw my son again. Those weeks were quiet but painful. The board had suspended Michael's executive duties pending the financial review. Word travels fast in the business community, even if the company managed to avoid a public scandal. Investors backed away for the time being, and articles began surfacing online using phrases like internal restructuring and leadership uncertainty. Michael vanished from the social scene almost overnight. It's funny how quickly wealthy people stop calling the moment someone's status becomes uncertain. But none of that stung as much as the silence. The first few days after returning from Dallas, I could barely sleep. The dinner replayed in my mind over and over again, the shame in Michael's eyes, the cruelty in his voice, and the moment he let someone place me near the kitchen. Some wounds keep throbbing long after the words stop. Still, I woke up every morning and stuck to my routine. I drank coffee from Carlos's old mug, watered the garden, and volunteered at the church. Life has a strange way of keeping you moving forward, even when your heart is broken. Emma called me almost every night. Sometimes we would talk for an hour, and sometimes she just wanted me on the line while she did her homework because, in her words, my voice made everything feel calmer. I think she needed some stability after everything that had happened. Truthfully, so did I. Vanessa called once too, which surprised me. "I left Michael," she said flatly the moment I answered. I sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. "What happened?" A long silence followed before she spoke. "I don't know who he is anymore." There was genuine sadness in her voice, not dramatic sadness, but the heavy, exhausted kind that comes when an illusion finally shatters. "He's trying," she added softly, "but I don't know if he even figures himself out yet." I didn't know either, and that was the frightening part. Sometimes people apologize because they fear the consequences, sometimes they apologize because they've truly changed, and sometimes they don't even know the difference themselves yet. Then, on a late Thursday evening just after sunset, there was a gentle knock on my front door. Before opening it, I already knew who it was. A mother always knows. Michael was standing on the porch wearing jeans, work boots, and a plain dark sweatshirt. There was no expensive watch and no luxury car behind him, just an old pickup truck parked under the street lamp. For a second, he looked so much like Carlos it almost broke me right there. "Hi, Mom," his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. It wasn't weak, it was humble. I stepped aside silently. "Come on in." Michael walked in slowly, looking around the small living room as if he hadn't truly seen it in years. The faded sofa, the old family photos, and Carlos's recliner still resting untouched by the window. Everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow we were different. "I forgot it smells like cinnamon in here," he said softly. I gave a faint smile. "I did some baking earlier." He nodded awkwardly, and then a heavy silence fell between us. I gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" "Yeah, please." While I prepared the 2 mugs, Michael was exceptionally quiet behind me. I couldn't help but notice his hands. They were rough, with redness around the knuckles, no longer soft like they used to be. "Have you been working?" I asked gently. He nodded. "At one of the hotel properties." I turned around slightly. "Doing what?" Another pause. "Maintenance." That caught me off guard, and Michael noticed my reaction. The board said if I wanted any chance of rebuilding trust, I needed to learn the company from the ground up again. Something rolled over painfully in my chest. For the first time in years, he didn't sound like an executive. He sounded like the hardworking boy Carlos had raised. I handed him his coffee carefully. He held the warm mug with both hands, not drinking for several seconds. Finally he spoke. "I hated being poor." The raw honesty of his voice filled the kitchen, and I sat down across from him. "I know." "No," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the coffee. "I mean, I really hated it. I hated hearing the other kids laugh at Dad's truck." I kept quiet. I hated when we pretended not to notice that other families had more food than us. My throat tightened. "And I hated watching you come home exhausted every single night, pretending you weren't tired." Tears instantly filled my eyes because I never knew he had noticed so much. Michael swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I think somewhere along the way, I started believing that being successful meant becoming completely different from who we were. I studied my son closely. Tonight felt different. There were no defenses or illusions, just the truth. And whenever people reminded me of where I came from, he continued quietly, I panicked. I thought back to the restaurant, the investors, the embarrassment, and the shame. It wasn't an excuse but an explanation, and there is a difference. Michael finally looked up to meet my eyes, "But none of that justifies how I treated you." The tears in his eyes looked real, raw, and entirely unguarded. Suddenly I remembered him at 15, apologizing after accidentally denting Carlos's truck. He had cried harder over letting us down than over the damage itself. That boy was still in there somewhere. "I was cruel," he whispered. I looked down at my coffee. Yes, you were. The truth pained both of us. Michael nodded slowly. Do you know what the worst part is? Seeing your face after I said those things. His voice cracked heavily, and I still didn't stop. That statement broke my heart more than anything else, because it meant he finally understood where the real damage was. It wasn't the investors or the corporate consequences, it was me. I don't know how to forgive myself, he admitted. I stared at my son for a long time before asking softly, Why did you come tonight, Michael? He answered immediately, because losing the company terrified me. The honesty surprised me. But losing you terrifies me more. Silence filled the kitchen. Outside, the crickets chirped softly in the warm Texas summer night. Michael wiped his eyes roughly. I keep hearing Emma ask me if you would still love me without the money. I smiled wistfully. And what do you think? He managed a tearful smile. I realized you've spent your entire life proving that you would. That nearly brought me to tears again. Michael leaned forward slowly. I spent years trying to be an important man. You were always important. He shook his head. No, I became an impressive man. That's not the same thing. The wisdom in those words felt hardened. For several seconds we just sat together in the quiet. We weren't fixed or completely healed, just honest. Finally, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny object, a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward me. I unfolded it carefully. It was an old photo of Carlos and me standing beside Michael at his college graduation. All three of us were smiling, young, hopeful and whole. I found it in my office drawer yesterday, Michael whispered, and I realized something. I looked up at him. My entire life, tears filled his eyes again. I kept trying to be successful enough so I wouldn't feel ashamed anymore. He paused, but Dad never looked ashamed once. No, Carlos never did. Even during our hardest years, he carried a dignity that no one could take away. I reached across the table slowly and held my son's trembling hand. I don't know if trust can be completely restored overnight, I whispered honestly. Michael nodded. I know, but I believe people can change when they finally start telling themselves the truth. He closed his eyes briefly as a tear fell. Then, for the first time in years, my son wept openly in front of me without hiding it. And this time I held him just like I did when he was a boy. Not because he was instantly forgiven, but because healing always has to start somewhere. 6 months later, my dining room table was full again. Not with investors or wealthy strangers pretending to appreciate one another, but with family. Real family. The kind that sits too close, passes food around, interrupts stories halfway through, and laughs louder than necessary. The kind of family we almost lost. I stood in the kitchen, putting the final touches on a tray of enchiladas, while Emma's laughter echoed through the house. The warm evening sun poured through the curtains Carlos had picked out years ago, painting the room in a golden hue. For the first time in a long time, my home felt fully alive again. Grandma, Emma yelled from the living room, Dad burned the garlic bread. I didn't burn it, Michael protested immediately. You absolutely burned it. I smiled to myself. Hearing them bicker felt incredibly healing. As I carried the food into the dining room, Michael stood up right away to help me. It wasn't because guests were watching or to maintain appearances. It was simply because he noticed I was carrying something heavy. That difference meant everything. Careful, he murmured, taking the heavy tray from my hands. Our eyes met briefly. There was still sadness in his eyes sometimes, still regret. Those things don't disappear overnight, but there was also a new humility, and humility changes a person. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later, bringing dessert from the bakery down the street. Her relationship with Michael remained complicated. They had started going to counseling together, slowly trying to rebuild trust. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that mattered far more. It smells amazing in here, she said as she walked in. You say that every time right before you eat 3 servings, Emma teased. Vanessa laughed, and it felt like the first genuine laugh I had heard from her in months. I learned it from your grandmother. I rolled my eyes playfully. Don't bring me into your bad habits. The warmth in the room still surprised me sometimes. Just 6 months ago, I truly believed our family was broken beyond repair. But when people finally stop lying to themselves, the pain changes shape. Michael had spent the last 6 months under strict board supervision, working at the ground level of the hotel properties, handling maintenance shifts, front desk training, cleaning crews, and coordinating with suppliers. There was no executive office, no luxury perks, and no special treatment. At first, he hated it. Every time we spoke on the phone, I could hear the frustration in his voice. But gradually, something shifted. He called me one night after helping fix a plumbing issue in an employee housing building. "Do you know what's strange?" he asked. "I never actually learned most of these employees' names before." That statement stayed with me for days because entitlement slowly blinds people. It teaches them to see service instead of human beings, but humility allows you to truly see again. The board eventually allowed Michael to step back into limited operational duties. It wasn't because I demanded it, but because several department managers quietly reported that he had changed. "He actually listens now," Sophia told me over coffee one afternoon. The surprise in her voice made me chuckle softly. "He used to walk through the properties like he was inspecting machinery. Now he actually connects with people." I thought about that often. Sometimes growth doesn't show up in dramatic ways. It shows up in the smaller things: patience, listening, and showing kindness to people who can't do anything for your status. Those are the true markers. Tonight, as everyone gathered around my old table, I watched Michael closely from across the room. He looked different now, not poorer but lighter, no longer obsessed with proving himself. Emma sat happily beside him, sharing school gossip while Vanessa helped set the table. Every few minutes, Michael would catch my eye and look at me quietly, as if he were still afraid this peace would disappear if he stopped being grateful for even a moment. Perhaps that fear is healthy. Some lessons should stay with us forever. "All right," Emma announced dramatically. "Family rule for tonight, no business talk." "Agreed," Vanessa said immediately. Michael raised his hands in surrender. "Trust me, I'm more than happy to leave business out of this." We all laughed softly, and then a comfortable silence settled over the table. It was the kind of silence a family earns after surviving a storm together. Michael looked around the room slowly, taking in the old photos on the wall, Carlos's chair by the window, and finally me. "I used to hate this house," he admitted quietly. None of us were surprised by his honesty anymore, but he continued before anyone could react. "It wasn't because of the house itself," he lowered his eyes. "I associated it with feeling small." I listened carefully. Michael took a deep breath, looking around once more. "But now I think it's the richest place I've ever been." Tears instantly filled my eyes. It wasn't because the statement sounded dramatic, but because he finally understood. Money creates comfort, but love creates value, and those two are never the same thing. Vanessa reached under the table and squeezed his hand quietly. Emma smiled at both of them, and suddenly I felt Carlos's presence everywhere in that room, in the laughter, the healing, and the second chance this family had somehow found after nearly destroying itself. Michael looked at me again. "I still think about that night sometimes." The room grew quieter. I knew exactly which night he meant: the restaurant, the humiliation, and the words neither of us would ever completely forget. "I do too," I admitted softly. Pain crossed his face instantly. "I wish I could take those words back." I nodded slowly. "I know. But maybe," he swallowed hard, "maybe if that hadn't happened I would have just kept getting worse." That truth sat heavily on the table. Sometimes hitting rock bottom is exactly where the healing begins. Emma creased her brow slightly. "I still can't believe you told Grandma she was too poor to sit somewhere." Michael closed his eyes briefly in embarrassment. "Trust me," he muttered, "I can't believe it either." Then he looked straight at me. "Do you know what the craziest part is? I thought money made a person important." His voice cracked slightly. "But in the end, the person everyone respected the most was you." I smiled wistfully. "No, sweetie." He frowned. "No." I shook my head gently. "The most important thing isn't respect." The room went quiet again. "The most important thing is remembering that before we belong to anything else, we belong to each other." Michael stared at me for a few seconds, then slowly nodded. For the first time in years, I saw peace in my son's eyes instead of hunger. Not a hunger for success, not a hunger for validation, just peace. Outside, the Texas sky darkened into night as laughter slowly returned to the room around us. There were no crystal chandeliers, no investors, and no luxury dining, just an old table filled with people who had finally learned how to truly love one another again. And somehow, that felt far richer than anything money could ever buy. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how easy it is to lose track of what truly matters until life forces us to stop and look again. Now I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Evelyn was right to forgive Michael? If you were humiliated like that in public, could you find it in your heart to forgive? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. And before you go, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It always amazes me how stories can bring people together from all corners of the world.